Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm Dan, and this is Forlorn Hobbies.
Hello and welcome back to the channel. Now, given the recent announcement by Tim over at Napoleonic Wargaming that the Under Eagles to Glory 3 event is coming at the end of February next year, I thought it would be a good time to tackle a controversial area amongst historical wargamers, and that is to look a little bit more into points versus Orbats when it comes to our games. So, which option is best? Well, I think that's a very divisive point within the historical community, in terms of gaming at least, because I don't think there is a clear and easy answer. Both have many strengths and weaknesses when it comes to a hobby perspective. And I will try and offer my thoughts kind of probably in a rambling way as usual, but I would be interested to see whether you agree with me or you have your own kind of views on this matter in the comments. Now, before I really go into it, I want to look at kind of where I'm coming from as a hobbyist. Now, I've always been historically kind of focused. I've been absolutely obsessed since a very young age with all things historical, and my introduction into the world of miniatures was as a result of my obsession with Age of Empires. And my father mistook the local Games Workshop as a computer gaming shop to see if he could get me the next edition of Age of Empires. Now, instead, which was probably a very bad decision on his side for both himself and my bank balance, I left with the Empire and Orc starter set. Now, I wasn't drawn to Games Workshop because of their space marine futuristic kind of ness. It was the bright, vibrant colours of the, I think, 5th or 6th edition Empire uniforms that reminded me as a 7 or 8 year old nerd, in essentially, of the Landsneck uniforms and imagery that I had seen from various historical games and museums that I had visited at the time. So it was the best thing that I could think of that I knew about. And this is in an age before we had Facebook and all that kind of social media and awareness, where the internet was on a lovely dial up modem. So research wasn't necessarily the strong point when it came to miniatures gaming. I didn't know about historical miniatures until I found a more general miniature shop on holiday. And then from there, it was kind of a rabbit hole of financial irresponsibility, should we say. So, from a historical kind of mindset point of view, I lean more towards an Orbat system, the orders of battle, because you want to recreate those moments in history. Now, the program Time Commanders was on TV that I used to watch on a Friday night, I think it was, and where you would have a family take on a historical battle and try and change the course of history, should we say. And I think that sums up my interest and quite a lot of others' interests in historical gaming. It's always about the what if factor. Now, you don't play historical war games to literally recreate that moment step by step by step. You want to see whether you can be as good as the general in charge. You want to be the next Alexander. You want to be the next Wellington or Napoleon. And it's about that strategy. Would I do this different? Oh, I've been studying. I don't know, the Battle of Thermopylae, and you look at the tactics with modern perspective, and you want to see if it can be something completely different. You don't want to just play the same thing over and over again. You want to play it and try new tactics with a better perception to try and change the outcome. I mean, we had a 100 days campaign that we've been working through, where the outcome of Quatre Bras was a decisive French victory. Now, we as a group then looked at it and went, well, let's do Ligny and see what the outcome was there. And from our what if kind of perspective approach, we completely changed the way that that campaign was fought. We could have just gone, well, yeah, we'll still do Waterloo, but it didn't really make sense from that perspective. But obviously, you had the standing armies at the time, so the Orbats were available, and we were still able to follow them because the deployment was pretty similar. We just decided that the French would pursue the Prussians because that was the bigger threat, as the British were pretty decimated at Quatre Bras. So we kind of flipped the the scenario where the British, or what was left of the British, was coming to assist the Prussians against the French rather than the historical way around. And it allows you, like having an Orbat gives you a structure in that system that you can still work from, and that's realistic, that allows you to have that kind of real time approach, even if you want to change that kind of campaign to reflect the outcome on the tabletop. Because you still have the units, that unit was removed or that unit has been decimated. So you can reduce and tweak it to give it a much more realistic approach. Now, the general principles of the order of battle is this is what was fighting or present at the battle. This is how big the unit was. This is what the brigade looked like. And it gives you the overview of the entire battle. Now, from a collecting standpoint, the Orbat wins hands down from a historical perspective because you are collecting a specific battle or a specific corps or division within a battle or a campaign. And it allows you to have a beginning and an end to your collection goal. Now, just off the top of my head, you want a collected division. You pick Picton's third in the peninsula, and that's a very realistic hobby approach. Now, where I think the Orbat has its issues is that when it comes to the gaming perspective, unless you want to fight the whole battle, the Orbat approach can be very narrowing of variety. So if you want to play a competitive, well, not competitive, but a game of Black Powder, for instance, you want the three elements that consist of the army. You want your infantry, you want your artillery, and you want your cavalry. Now, with an Orbat, especially during the Napoleonic era, most armies were very structured in that your divisions consisted of infantry and then you would have separate cavalry divisions. Now, unless you could find a specific point in the battlefield that you could hone in on and get a good variety of brigades shown on the tabletop, you would just be painting a lot of infantry and very little else. So, in contrast, having a points game allows you to have what reflects as a much more balanced army that might not necessarily have fought together in proximity in the battle. So, as a collector, primarily, most of my projects come from looking at orders of battle. That doesn't mean to say that I follow them religiously. I will quite happily change a regiment to be a regiment that I prefer. So, my British Army, for instance, I am following the order of battle for Salamanca in terms of the structure of the British forces and the Portuguese, but the regiments that I'm choosing to represent within that come from my personal preference of regiments that I have some kind of interest in or kind of family link to or regional link to. So I live in North Notts, so obviously I'm going to have the Nottinghamshire Regiment and the Yorkshire regiments. But then I'm also going to have other regiments that interest me as opposed to looking at the order of battle and having the specific regiments. So that just gives me a little bit more of a personal attachment to that collection. So I think an Orbat is great for structure. It's the biggest strength that it has. It gives you a clear kind of focal point for your collection. But it can, unless you're committed to doing the whole thing, you find a small-ish battle and you're happy to collect both sides, then I think that works really well in a club setting where you go, right, I'm going to do this battle. Would you like to play it? You can take it to events, you can take it to shows, and you can put on a game. Now, that's probably the standard approach, I think, because when you, I don't know, let's say I'm going to play the British at Salamanca, I might pick a small section, let's say the left flank. You walk into your club and you go, right, has anyone got the French right flank from Salamanca? It's going to be very hard to have games. So I think the mindset of most hobbyists is to do a specific portion of the battle for both sides. Or you have a friend that you kind of work with consistently in planning the project. So it's a fixed period in time that you're focusing on, which is obviously from a historical perspective, that's the whole point of my hobby, is to find who wants to see if we can change the course of Catchebra. Richie is a big fan of Catchebra. I don't know how many times he's played it. I've lost count, but he always seems to want to play it again. You say Catchebra 3 times, and I'm sure he will appear. So you have that kind of thing. But then let's look at it from a points perspective. You have a lot more kind of freedom in what you want to collect. Most of the army lists again, just focusing on Black Powder for a moment, offer structure that doesn't look alien to an Orbat, but it just allows you to bring those elements together and put them on the tabletop a lot easier. It's not like, oh, I can take 5 brigades of guard and nothing else, or all cavalry. It doesn't give you silly things for abuse from a gaming perspective. It allows you to bring 2 infantry brigades, a cavalry brigade, and some artillery. And that gives you a good balanced force to play with. And what I think is really good about Tim's events is that it allows people to come together to play games that you wouldn't necessarily be able to play on a regular basis unless you are part of a club that has a big historical scene. And I think the people that have gone to the last couple of events have been great sports and people that you would know as a name on the internet and see some of the things like their posts that we follow in the Black Powder pages and stuff like that. But being able to talk to them in person, you can see their enjoyment for history, you can see their enjoyment for historical gaming, and it really is starting to turn into a nice little community at these events that you get at other events. Like, say, you go to a Lord of the Rings event at Warhammer World, you can see those communities of similar faces come together and everyone has a really good time. And I think it's huge credit to Tim for taking the time and effort to organize something like this, because I think it's something that the community needs. But when approaching it, obviously he had to find a balance between looking at putting on a historical game where, we just fight, say, Leipzig and have lots of people bring stuff for that. But then he didn't want to restrict people to having to bring X, Y, and Z. So the points based system really comes into its own from that perspective, where it gives someone their freedom to do what they want, but also bring a balanced force that will be able to fight another balanced force, which isn't something Orbats necessarily did. Quite often, historically, battles were one-sided, and the Orbats reflect that. You're going to have one person that's going to be able to overwhelm and push through, which was historically the victor, and then one person fighting a kind of rear guard, kind of, let's see how much damage we can minimize, rather than, oh, this is going to be a game to win. So it would be interesting to see in the future. Perhaps Tim might decide to look at specific battles and have like a kind of big gaming weekend. I know we've had a few within our group that have been great successes, and that there are other clubs and people that I know of. I can't think of specific group names, but they've just had the Leipzig game for up in Glasgow. I should really remember, because they sent me some lovely dice and tray and some kind of little measuring and markers, which are really nice. But it's good to see that you've got groups like this starting to emerge and do these kind of things to bring people together to share in the enjoyment of this great hobby. So I think each have their flaws, each have great strengths, and it's all about personal choice. Now, it's not something that's exclusive. You can either do an Orbat or you can do a points based army. I think it depends on the circumstances of what you want to achieve. Now, some of the projects that I'm looking at going forwards are specifically for historical gaming, are mainly order of battle focused, but that's because I'm taking a snippet out of a battle here and there. But I'm also looking at the scenarios from the rulebook, and there's a couple that have caught my eye. I want to do the Battle of Monarchy from the American Civil War, which is something that I'm working on in the background, and there is a Jacobite rising scenario in the Black Powder 2 rulebook that I'm very heavily considering doing as a long-term project, with the hopes of taking it and putting it on at a show in the future. But that's more, again, looking at specific pinpoints in time with a specific purpose. Now, these are things that I could take down the club and be like, right, Tim, let's play this, and have no problems whatsoever. I could also quite easily pull someone off the street and be like, right, let's play this battle, see what happens, and try and get them into the hobby. But that doesn't mean that we have to play it every single time. So with points-based armies, they're not exclusive. You can follow an Orbat and then take models from that to play a points-based game with. But in general, having a quick pickup game at a club is a lot easier using points than it is Orbats, unless you are going to provide both sides. And, ultimately, I think there is no wrong decision and there is no wrong answer to which one is better. I think they both have an equal place in the hobby. And I think it's a shame when you see people being kind of not necessarily elitist about it, but ultimately we all want the hobby to grow, because otherwise there'll stop being new sculpts eventually if there's no market for it. And we want to see it more accessible. So I think if you can put on a balanced points-based game to get people actively working on projects and being interested and having their own incentive to come into the community and help it build, that can only be a good thing. But also going to shows, seeing those dedicated hobbyists that want to recreate specific battles, there is just as big a place in the community for that. And I think we could all work together instead of pushing people away from going, oh, you're doing points based. It's not a real army, therefore I don't want to play it, or I don't want to know. Now, that's not saying that people have to follow it. It's your hobby. You do what you want to do. But I think the approach that Tim has for the event is great at bringing people together to grow the community. And I think the people putting on events at shows give people a great perspective into what this hobby can be, in terms of this is the effort that they've put in over many years to recreate a moment in history, to test the what if this could happen. And I think that is just as important to growing the community. But what is not good for growing the community is that kind of, oh, this is better than that approach, where we try and box everything in to fitting a rigid pattern, just like you have the button counters and stuff like that. Oh, the cuff cut is wrong on that model, therefore it's not that. Or, oh, you've painted it in a slightly different shade of blue. It's, some people paint how they want to. Now, I paint both historical and fantasy miniatures. I tend to follow uniform for historical, but then I kind of let my own creativeness go when it comes to fantasy, because there are cool schemes in my head that I want to try that obviously would look out of place on a historical miniature. I've also dabble into the bring what if approach to history. If a certain event hadn't happened, could we have seen some kind of development of that state? Now, the perfect example of that is my Napoleonic Byzantine project that I'm slowly working on, as if what had happened, whether it was some kind of Greek resurgence a couple of decades earlier, or what if Constantinople didn't fall kind of approach. Now, that's just a lot of hypotheticals, and I think it's a lot more common in gaming than people might think, because there are lots of events that could have happened completely differently if a tiny little thing had gone a different way. What if Harold won the Battle of Hastings? All these different kind of things. And it allows people to show their creativeness, that as well as their kind of interests in the hobby. And that can only be a good thing for the wider community. So it just really grumbles me when I see people getting a bit snooty about certain elements. It's very OCD sometimes with like historical gaming. Um, that's great because you want it to be a recreation of history. But I think there is also room for a little bit of variation and creativity as well. And I think that's a strong point of points based games, where some factions don't have rules, some factions don't have armies. It can be quite limited in that sense. And so you can have a hypothetical Orbat that allows you to play the games. And I think that works just as well. But when you're trying to bring people together and have a gaming weekend, I think points is the way forward, unless you are focusing on a specific battle with a lot more constraints on what a person can bring or contribute. Now, we could just as easily put on a game of, let's say, Salamanca, and say to people, right, you're going to bring this division, you're going to bring that division, and so on. And you'll have a great time recreating the battle. You can have various levels of engagement within that battle. I think the first game of Black Powder that I played was a game kind of like that, and I spent essentially 5 hours of that game with my cavalry being either disordered or failing orders. So my overall engagement in that game was quite minimal. But then I've played points games which bring the same amount of people, or if not more, together, and my engagement is 100% because I am playing constantly. So I think that is probably the better approach when you're trying to build a community and expand interest outside of kind of shows or kind of like club games. Anyway, I think I've rambled on for far too long. So many thanks to those of you who have endured to this point. I will hope to see you at Tim's event if you are going. The details for which can be found over on his channel. And I hope to see you all in the next one.
Thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. Until next time, enjoy your hobby.